What can we learn from reading the classics? That's the question that the Interintellect Reading the Great series tries to answer. This video is for people who've maybe seen some buzz online about the Interintellect Salon series, or for the, albeit slightly smaller group of people who want to know what I've been up to for the past few months. In this video, I'll talk about the Interintellect, what it is, what's a salon and how they work. I'll talk about the Reading the Great series, and I'll talk a little bit about the literature of Antiquity, which is the first era of the series, the first 3 salons. So what is the Interintellect? Well, it's a group of people brought together by Antigone, the founder, to get together and discuss the ideas of philosophy, literature, technology, the past, the present, the future, a really wide range of topics. It started pre-pandemic, but over the last year or so, it's really grown into an online community with multiple Zoom sessions per week, discussing a wide range of topics. If you go on the Interintellect website, you'll see just a vast range of stuff that people are interested in talking about. So who's it for, and who turns up to salons? So it's not just experts, it's people with an amateur interest, it's people with a specific point of view, it's people with a different perspective maybe than you have. So it's a really wide range of people, and you can get a lot of different ways of looking at the topics, whether it be from people from different cultural backgrounds or different life experiences. So in a salon, there's a host, and the host usually sets a couple of pieces to read before the salon in preparation so that people can all be roughly on the same page for the topic that's under discussion. They might lead the salon a little bit, prompting questions or talking points, but a lot of the time the discussion is led by the group to where the group want to take it. The Reading the Great salon started in January by Tommy Collison and David McDougall. So Tommy had written a big list of books from mainly the canon of Western literature that he wanted to read over the next few years. He condensed that down to 15 months worth of salons, 1 book per salon, in order to give people a taster of that Western canon. Each salon has 1, maybe 2 books to read, plus a number of secondary material, whether it be other books, reinterpretations of books, translations, or maybe some links to articles. People can really read as much as they want. Typically there's recommendations for chapters or sections of the books to read if you're a bit pushed for time. But if you're interested in the Salon series, it's a good idea to read around it, and you can consider the Salon as a sort of jumping off point to further explore the literature. So each salon lasts about 3 hours. People discuss the book, they discuss articles related to the book, and the topics and themes and questions that the book prompts. There's also an online Discord discussion group for people who want to post links between the salons. So the series is divided up into eras, and each era is 3 salons. The first one is on the literature of Antiquity. So that's Homer, that's Sophocles and Plato. Then we move on to the medieval and Christian world, looking at books like Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales. The next era is from the Reformation to the Industrial Revolution, so looking at Machiavelli the Prince and perhaps some Shakespeare. Then there's the early modernity period with Pride and Prejudice, Frankenstein, Reflections on the Revolution in France, and then late modernity with books like Mrs. Dalloway, 1984 and Brave New World. So this all prompts the question, well, what have we got to learn from the great books? Why is it worth reading them? What is it that they can give us in this day and age? And is the canon really the best place to start, or are there sort of wider places to look? So I think it's still worthwhile. And in preparation for the Salon series, I read around a couple of books on authors and other people explaining what they got from the classics and why they think it's still worth it. The first one of those books was Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. And in this book, he explores a little bit about our time and place, social media, and also looks back through history and literature in order to figure out what it might give us. One of the quotes that I liked from this book was on Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher, writing in his introduction to the history of the Peloponnesian War as to what he got from history. Hobbes wrote, "For the principal and proper work of history is to instruct and enable men by the knowledge of actions past, to bear themselves prudently in the present and providentially towards the future." I think that's a really good sentiment, and it says we can look back in history and we can figure out some of the answers that people had to the timeless questions which we've still got today. So now I'm going to go on and chat a little bit about what we've talked about in the first 3 salons. So that's the literature of Antiquity era. So there was a lot to discuss, and we started with Homer and the Iliad. What better place to start than some ancient Greek epic poetry. So I've not read much of this kind of thing before. So in some ways it was a bit of a shock to the system, what is this, how to interpret it. We chatted about, let me do this one great thing, the tagline of the salon. It's about the appeal to posterity, the let me do this great thing, maybe I'll die, but at least I'll be remembered. How can we relate to that in modern days? Is that still something that people aspire to, or that we should aspire to? How else might we express the desires behind that type of thinking? I decided to read around a bit. I also picked up a copy of the Aeneid by Virgil. This translation was by Shadi Barch, and I thought it was excellent. It was a good view from the Roman side of the poetry, and it fleshed out some more of the mythology and story arising out of the Trojan War, and obviously reworked for a Roman audience. So well recommended. Book that I haven't read yet, which is the Odyssey. That is on the list of things to read now that I've read the Iliad. So I picked up the Emily Wilson translation, which I know is highly recommended. Lastly, on the Greek myths front, I would recommend Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths by Natalie Haynes. So this book talks about women in the myths, their role, and how they've perhaps been reinterpreted or reinvented according to the ages. Women are often neglected in the retelling of the stories, but there's some quite interesting details that are drawn out through this examination of each of the women in the myths. So if you're reading round the topic of the Iliad, the Trojan War, the old epic poetry, these old myths and heroes and so on, I would really recommend Pandora's Jar to kind of flesh out and add meat to the bones of those stories. The second salon in the series was on Sophocles' Antigone, the play that examines the relationship between people, the gods, their obligations to the family, and the state. So it's a play that's been reworked and reinterpreted many times, especially in the modern era coming out of World War II. It has an anti-authoritarian bent to it. We started by reading a standard translation, but also picked up Seamus Heaney's The Burial at Thebes, which is a lovely poetic reworking of the story. The discussion here was about, what codifies our morals? Who do we have obligations to? Personally, and if you're in charge of the city, what are your obligations in running that state? And I think the interesting thing that came out of this is that it never quite really resolved. There are merits to both sides of the story, the kind of need for law and order, the need for maintaining discipline between people, but also the personal obligations. What happens when something that you feel profoundly about comes into conflict with that? What rights do you have, or what duties do you have? The last salon in the series was on the last days of Socrates, the Plato dialogues, dealing with the trial and the execution and death of Socrates. Another interesting set of topics. I'd never really read much Plato, and it was a whole different style of literature to get used to. But it was good to dig in and sort of examine the various arguments and try and pick apart what Plato was saying that Socrates had said in his final days. So some of the topics that we discussed in the salon were around the philosophical life. Can you live a good philosophical life whilst also being involved in politics? Or like Socrates, do you have to avoid that in order to not be encumbered by the particular burdens that a political life places upon you? What is a good philosophical life? How should you live it? Is that life for everyone? Should it be something that everyone aspires to, or is it just a certain subset of people who find that useful? So this was a really interesting salon that kind of tied together some of the other salons. So in discussing Socrates' death, we could also go back and look at Antigone's death, or the deaths presented in the Iliad, to figure out, well, what is the thing that drives people to the different maybe styles or themes in the life in their lives that they are prepared to die for. We also discussed the myths that bring us together, so the cohesive myths that are required for a city or state to function, and how perhaps Socrates was challenging some of those, and therefore that's why he was condemned to death. So as you've heard, there was a lot that we've discussed across the three salons, and it was really interesting to hear the different perspectives that people brought to the table. So next up is the literature of the medieval period and the Christian world, starting with Beowulf. So if you're interested in following along or joining the season, check out the Interintellect website and social media, as there's occasionally tickets that come up for each of the sessions. So I'm really looking forward to the next set of discussions. And if you're interested, please do follow along, as I'll try and post on Twitter and more videos as the salons continue.